Earlier, we heard a song by Matthew West called Forgiveness. Pretty impressive song. What's even more impressive is that Matthew always tells people if they have a situation to write about it and send it to him, and maybe he'll write a song. Well, that's exactly what happened when he wrote the song called Forgiveness. He wrote it based upon a story that Renee Napier sent to him. Renee's daughter, Megan, and her best friend, Lisa, had spent the day at a Florida beach and were returning home. Both of the girls were 20 years of age. It was May 10th, 2002. As they traveled on the highway, they were hit by a drunk driver, and both of the girls were killed instantly. A young man by the name of Eric Smallridge was the drunk driver. He was only 22. He had just graduated from college. He was about ready to start a new career and set the groundwork for the rest of his life. And he had been drinking most of the afternoon with one of his friends and on into the evening, and didn't realize the effect that alcohol had had on his system and how much it had impaired him. Ultimately, Eric was found guilty of a DUI and of manslaughter of two individuals, which gave him a sentence, two consecutive sentences of 11 years each, which meant that he would spend the next 22 years of his life in a Florida prison. Megan's mom, Renee, went to a place that she really had never had a desire to go to. She was angry. She hated Eric. She was bitter, and her life took a nosedive, and it continued to get worse and worse with time. Finally, Renee realized that Eric was in a physical prison, where actually she was in a prison created within. And as she prayed about this and came to know what was transpiring within herself to a greater and greater degree, she decided that the only way she could resolve this issue was if she forgave Eric. And so she gave it a great deal of thought. And she wrote Eric and asked him if she could come visit him. And he agreed to the visit. And so in that visit, she forgave Eric. Eric was absolutely floored and dumbfounded. His statement was, "I can't even forgive myself for what I did. How can Megan or Renee possibly forgive me for what I did to her daughter and her friend?" It was, as time progressed, Renee continued to meet with Eric. And after a couple of years of being in prison and the meetings that he had gone through with Renee, she and Lisa's family came together and they decided that all of them would be in that place of forgiveness. And they would go to the judge that had heard his case and request that his sentence be lessened. And it's called a beggar's motion. And so 11 people sat before the judge and asked him to deter the sentence or lessen the sentence that Eric was experiencing for the death of the two daughters. The judge was absolutely dumbfounded for what they had done. And with that agreement, he decided to lessen the sentence and make it only 11 years. Now, the story doesn't end there, however, because the penal system within Florida agreed to let Eric attend meetings that Renee was going to, where she would speak about drunk driving. And sometimes Eric would show up in shackles, but he would talk about the cons of driving while drunk. And so Renee continued with those speaking engagements throughout Florida and ultimately throughout the United States. And when Eric was released from prison, he continued on that journey with Renee to speak to others about the perils of drunk driving. Forgiveness indeed is the hardest thing to give away. as he states in the song. Why? Because for a lot of people, it's easier for us to live in the past rather than in the present moment. It's easier to stay angry and hateful rather than opening up to love. Forgiveness is discovering the freedom within ourselves and loving the unlovable. So why is forgiveness so important? Why does it matter so much to our lives? The story of Renee Napier is just one example of how forgiveness frees us from our past. We fail to forgive when we keep trying to recreate a past in a more positive light. A lack of forgiveness keeps us attached to something that we can never, ever change. That's our past. Whenever we cling to those past grievances, we are placing ourselves in a mental prison and condemning ourselves to live in darkness without love. When we forgive, it allows us to stop recycling the old stories over and over and over again that keeps us stuck in that anger, in that hate, or that blame. Paul Lewis, a business executive, stated, "Forgiveness does not change the past, but it does enlarge the future." Why? Because we open our heart when we forgive. And as we open it, we experience love to a far greater degree. Once there were two brothers who owned adjacent farms, and no one knows why or how or when it happened. But at some point, they developed a bitter conflict between the two of them and stopped talking and stopped working with each other. Now, one day, John, the oldest of the two brothers, heard a knock at the door. And when he opened the door, there stood a carpenter with a toolbox who said, "I'm needing some work. I'm willing to work for a couple of days. Do you have a project that I can do for you?" And John's response was, "Absolutely, I've got a job for you. You see that land over there? That's my brother's land. And I want to tell you that there used to be a beautiful meadow out there for both of us to enjoy. But he took a bulldozer to the river and ran a creek right through the meadow. I want you to put up an 8-foot fence so that I don't ever have to see him, ever have to look at him again. Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I need?" And the carpenter looked at him and said, "Yep, I got the idea." And so John turned around and he went over and showed him where the wood was next to the barn that he could build the fence, and then took him to the shed where all the tools were so that he'd have the advantage of the electrical tools. And then he said, "I need to go in town today. I've got meetings, errands to run. I'll be back late this afternoon or early this evening. See how far you can get." And so John left and the carpenter went to work. And by the time John got home that night, he was anxious to see the new fence that had been put up. And instead of a fence, there was a bridge across the stream, across the creek that the carpenter had built. And John was upset and mad. And he found the carpenter. They started to walk down to the bridge. And with that, he looked over on the other side, and here came Tom, his younger brother. And they walked across that bridge at the same time and met in the center of the bridge. And Tom looked at him and said, "I am so sorry for all the trouble and challenges that I have caused. Can you ever forgive me? Thanks for building the bridge." The carpenter knew what he was doing when he did that. He knew what needed to be done. And when we forgive, we open a greater space within ourselves that can be filled with love and kindness. Forgiveness allows us to return to our true essence, which is love. Dr. Ernest Holmes, our founder, states, "If we hold a grudge, we bar ourselves from the highest expression of our divine nature. God never hates, nor does God hold feelings of bitterness towards any person. Thus, the grudge holder is trying to express God and something else which is impossible. Spirit is not cut up into little sections. No one can say, 'I will accept God's healing,' but not express God's love. Since spirit is indivisible, the person who refrains from expressing God's love will be unable to accept God's help. Therefore, we should express love, for love is the fulfillment of the law. We have known for many years that our mental attitude and our thought process also has a profound effect on our physical condition. We need only follow the writings of Louise Hay to understand that heart issues can be caused by feelings of hurt and resentment, or liver issues are about not forgiving ourselves or others, or dry eye can be caused also by refusing to forgive. There are so many connections between our physical health and our mental well-being that affects us and affects our process to forgive. You want to live a healthier life? Then it's time to forgive. Often what we need to forgive in others is something in our own very being that we have refused to heal, examine, or we've hidden from for a very long time. When we decide to withhold our forgiveness, in essence, we have chosen to suffer. Gerald Jamplowski, in his book, Forgiveness, the Greatest Healer of All, states to forgive is to feel the compassion, gentleness, tenderness, and caring that is always within our hearts. We can look upon forgiveness as the journey across an imaginary bridge from a world where we are always recycling our anger to a place of peace. That journey takes us into our own spiritual essence, which is the heart of God. Would you rather feel compassion or would you rather suffer? Remember, forgiving is discovering the freedom within by loving the unlovable. When we make that choice, that decision to forgive, it's like melting an iceberg that has frozen our heart that's lived there for so long. And as it melts, it opens us up in a new way to a new way of being. It opens us up to love others as well as to love ourselves. We can always find a multitude of reasons to not forgive. Let's see if any of these make sense to you or you've thought about them. If I forgive them, I'm weak. And I can't forgive them because I'd be a weak person. Or how about if I forgive someone, they'll just keep doing it over and over and over again. Or I don't like you. And I believe if I forgive you, I'll have control over you. When we don't forgive, we keep a distance between ourselves and the other person. In essence, it is our ego that is getting in the way of preventing us from moving to that place of forgiveness. When we refuse to forgive and push away love, we are coming from a place of ego and fear. Our ego loves to give us all the reasons why we shouldn't forgive. If we want to live a peaceful, loving, and compassionate life, we must be willing to release the obstacles that prevent us from forgiving others. Our first step is to let go of the belief that we must find someone to blame for what is happening in our life or what is wrong with our life. When we move to that place of blame, we often find ourselves clinging to that anger, the guilt, and shame. That's a heavy load to carry. That's the load that Renee Napier was carrying. Blame does not bring us happiness. It only serves to imprison us in negative thought patterns that we continue with. The next step is to let go of our fears. Often we project onto others what we perceive to be true and real in our life. Things that happen to us in our childhood that are deep within our conscious or subconscious mind. They haunt us over and over and over again because we haven't released or forgiven them. So often those deep beliefs based on childhood experiences become our adult fears, and those fears become our reality. time and time again. We become convinced that our uncomfortable thoughts, our feelings are caused by others, and situations are not within our control. Logically, we know this is not our truth. Emotionally, however, we don't want to let go of the past. We want to keep recreating it into something more happy, more loving, and more kind. But that's not going to happen. What is done is done. So often we stay attached to the past because it is what we are familiar with. As a police chaplain, I have often encountered women who were in abusive situations, who were being abused by a boyfriend or a husband, and they were emotionally, physically, or spiritually, or mentally, they were being abused. We counsel them, we talk to them, the officers do, so do I, and we indicate to them that we're willing to take them to a place that they will be safe, where a shelter, where they can take their children, where they can live free of this abuse. And so often they turn us down. And what I've come to understand about that is that they're really afraid of the unknown. Going to some place where the abuser is not is going into a future that is unknown. By going back to the abuser, at least they know what's going to happen. Because we have the power to choose our thoughts, our next step means letting go of the thoughts that no longer serve us. Love returns when we shift how we think and are willing to forgive. In his book on forgiveness, Dr. Chimplowski writes about his own transformation. He openly admits that he was an angry, nasty, mean guy in his 20s and 30s, and he would attack anybody that attacked him or that he would disagree with. He would belittle them, and he would attack them, and he didn't want them to get the one-upmanship on him. And he understood later that this was really all about his ego getting in the way of him loving. After 20 years of marriage, he and his wife, Pat, agreed to divorce. He felt guilty. He felt hostility. He felt shame. He felt self-blame. And he also found the bottle and became an alcoholic. A few years later, he discovered A Course in Miracles, and life began to shift for him. His struggle with blame and guilt and shame began to be released, and forgiveness stepped into his life. Every day he concentrated on his ex-wife, Pat, and he would put her in light and love and surround her in that. And he asked God for help to forgive himself and his ex-wife. It didn't take too long when he began to notice the tension he had felt for so very long in his life began to melt away, just like that iceberg in the heart. Ultimately, they became good friends once again. And the way Gerald explains it is, I surrendered to love rather than fear. So just what is yours to do with forgiveness? In Proverbs 17:9, it states, "He who forgets an offense seeks friendship, but he who hates to forget an offense estranges himself from a friend and a neighbor." So the choice is there. You can forgive and have a multitude of friends, or you can well yourself off from others. It's important for us to go deep within and look at who we have not forgiven yet. Maybe you thought you'd forgiven somebody, but the residue still remains. In 2015, I walked the Camino in Spain. At some place in the journey, I realized that I had some forgiveness to do. And even though I thought I had forgiven these people, these were the individuals who were instrumental in my being dismissed from my last city job. I truly thought that I had released them, but I realized as I walked that I had not. So one night I sat down and I listed all the names: city council, city manager. I listed all the names of all the people who had been involved in that challenge. And I was surprised when the list was so long. And then I began the process of forgiveness. I took my rosary out, and on each and every bead, I would state the following: I forgive you, John, for all that you have done. I love you, John, as I love myself. God's the love that I am. And I did a complete rosary for every person on the list. And by the time I completed that list, I felt so free. I felt I had the experience of letting go of a past that was over 24 years old. I felt a burden that had been lifted from me and my heart opening wider. So the first thing you can do is make a list of people who may still need to be forgiven. Remember, forgiveness is discovering the freedom within by loving the unlovable. If you are unable to forgive the individual because they are deceased or because you have no way of finding them, you can still sit down and write a letter to them. You can write a poem. You can journal in your journal, indicating your willingness to forgive them, and then have a ceremony of releasing what you have written. Choose to not be a victim anymore. Many of you may remember the San Francisco earthquake in 1989. And there was a family who their home was completely destroyed that lived in San Francisco, and they were unable to really rebuild it. And so they decided to live to the Oakland Hills. Well, I don't know if you remember or not, but within a few years, the Oakland fire occurred within the Oakland Hills, and everything in their home was once again destroyed and lost. What they did was to honor their feelings and forgive what seemed to happen to them. Rather than staying victims, they moved on with their lives. There will always be natural disasters. Asking why doesn't help. The answer will never come. Instead, ask what. What is mine to do? What can I learn from this situation? What can I do to move forward? Making a decision to live in the present moment, not the past, is also important to our forgiveness. Henry Landworth had survived Auschwitz during World War II, and he saw life when it was at its worst. He saw people that he hated and that he was angry with because of the way that they treated them. And he was in grief because of the loss of his entire family. Henry decided to start a new life, and he moved to America after the war and became a very successful businessman. But his heart was still filled with hatred for the German people and the German government. Because of his business success, however, he decided that he was going to start an organization called Give the Kids the World. He saw children who had life-threatening diseases who were unable to have fun. And so he would bring them to Florida for a whole week with their family, and they'd do Disneyland and Universal Studios. And ultimately, he built a village where the families would live for the week, and the kids could play and swim and ride merry-go-rounds and have a good time and forget that they had a life-threatening disease. It was For him, there was a transformation that began to happen to him with those children. He forgave the Germans finally. He forgave those who had harmed him when he was in Auschwitz. And Henry believes it's because of the love that he received from the children and their families that made it possible for him to forgive. And there comes a time for all of us to forgive ourselves. Often we still carry guilt or shame for something that we did from our own childhood. Forgiveness releases us from that self-imposed prison. Remember, we can't change the past, but we can choose our thoughts to stay in the present moment. Be clear that your only intention is to love and peace of mind when you forgive. When we forgive another person, we're also forgiving ourselves in the process. The chorus in the song Forgiveness is very simple. Forgiveness, 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 forgiveness. Show me how to love the unlovable. Show me how to reach the unreachable. Help me now to do the impossible. Forgiveness. Always remember, forgiveness is discovering the freedom within by loving the unlovable. This is the truth in my life, and this is the truth in yours, and so it is.